everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know those moments when you're listening to an audiobook and suddenly you realize you've pictured the entire scene in your mind?
Absolutely.
Like it's playing out in your head like a movie.
Yeah.
Turns out that's not just our imaginations running wild, it's actually a potential memory superpower.
Ah,
That's right, we're diving into the world of audiobooks and memory.
I love it.
We're going to tackle that age-old question. Are audiobooks just as good as real books for remembering things?
Yeah.
Expert speaker, ready to decode the science of story time and maybe bust some myths along the way.
Absolutely. We got a stack of research on how audiobooks tap into our brains, and it's pretty fascinating, sometimes in ways that traditional reading just doesn't.
Love it. Okay, so let's address the elephant in the room right away. Does listening actually measure up to reading when it comes to memory retention?
Well, I think the short answer is it's not as black and white as some might think.
Okay.
Research suggests audiobooks can be just as effective as those paperbacks we know and love.
Really? So no need to feel guilty about those hours spent lost in a good audiobook?
Not necessarily. I mean, think about those captivating narrators. They breathe life into characters. They make emotions practically leap out of the headphones.
Right.
That vivid auditory experience, it really creates a lasting impression in a way that words on a page sometimes just can't.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's like the difference between watching a movie and just reading the script.
Yeah.
The visuals and the audio together, it just makes it stickier.
Exactly. It's not just about the words themselves. It's how those words make you feel, the pictures that they spark in your mind. That's where things get really interesting, because there's evidence that audiobooks might actually boost memory through visualization, through imagination.
Okay, this is blowing my mind a bit. So instead of being a weakness, audiobooks, because they engage our auditory senses so well, could actually be a strength when it comes to memory.
Good.
Explain this magic.
Okay, so think about it this way. With traditional reading, you're creating the entire world of the book in your head. But with a well-narrated audiobook, it's like having a personal tour guide through someone else's imagination.
Oh, I totally get that. It's like you're not even realizing that you're picturing like the furniture or the clothes or the lighting because you're so engrossed in listening.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly it. That visualization process, it helps encode information more deeply in your brain. You're not just passively consuming words, you're building a world, and that leads to better recall later on.
Wow. So we're essentially building memory palaces in our minds as we listen to our favorite narrators.
Ah.
I love it. Now, we do have to acknowledge that it's not all sunshine and roses with audiobooks, right? What about mind wandering? Sometimes I get lost in those soothing voices and suddenly I'm reorganizing my sock drawer.
Right.
Does that mean audiobooks are inherently worse for focus?
Not necessarily, but it is a real phenomenon. Think of your brain like a computer. Too many tabs open and it starts to slow down.
Yeah.
That's what we call cognitive load. And audiobooks, especially if the reader's got that really nice, soothing voice, they don't require all the processing power that reading does.
Okay.
Our brains are wired to seek out stimulation, so if we're not actively engaged, our minds will find something else to do.
So like trying to study for a big exam while also scrolling through social media and planning your next vacation, not a recipe for success.
Exactly. And individual experiences play a huge role here, right? So the key is to be mindful of your listening environment and your habits. If you're trying to absorb some really complex information, listening while you're out for a jog is probably not the best idea. Finding a quiet space, minimizing those distractions, those things make a big difference for any kind of learning, but especially for audiobooks.
That makes total sense. You've got to give your brain a fighting chance to focus. But before we dive into specific tips for getting the most out of our audiobook time, we've got to talk about how audiobooks can be a game changer for people with dyslexia, people with visual impairments.
Absolutely. For those individuals, audiobooks aren't just a preference. They are a lifeline to a world of literature and information that may otherwise be difficult or even impossible to access.
It's amazing how this technology can break down those barriers and create a more inclusive experience.
Yeah.
And speaking of making knowledge more accessible, we've got some research here about language learners and how audiobooks can be really, really helpful for them too. It's like having a personal language tutor right there in your ears.
Yeah, I mean, language acquisition is all about immersion. It's about surrounding yourself with the sounds, the rhythms of this new language. Audiobooks offer that immersive experience, but in a very structured and accessible way.
It really is. It's like that study abroad experience, but for your ears.
Huh.
Okay. Instead of struggling with textbooks, you're swept away by the story and absorbing the language organically.
Exactly. And because audiobooks are often narrated by native speakers, you're hearing those subtle nuances of pronunciation, the intonation, things that can be tricky to grasp otherwise.
It's those little things that make such a big difference when you're trying to really master a language. But it strikes me that whether we're talking about accessibility, language learning, or just trying to remember what we listened to last week, there's this common thread of maximizing brain power. So for all of us audiobook enthusiasts out there, what are some practical tips for really making that knowledge stick?
The first one might seem obvious, but it's amazing how often we neglect it, and that's active listening.
Okay.
It's so easy to just let an audiobook fade into the background while we're doing other things, maybe chores around the house or commuting. But if we really want to retain that information, we've got to be engaged.
So put down the phone, silence those notifications, and tell our brains to close all those extra tabs, right? No more audiobook multitasking.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about visualization boosting memory?
Yes.
We can take that a step further
Yeah.
with another powerful technique, and that is note-taking.
Note-taking, really? I thought that was just for students cramming for exams.
Not at all. Think of it as having a conversation with the book, jotting down those key points, maybe some interesting quotes, or even just your own reflections. It helps to solidify those ideas in your mind.
So instead of passively absorbing information, we're actively engaging with it, almost like creating our own little mini study guide as we go.
Exactly. And here's another tip that often gets overlooked: repetition. Think about how we learn language as children. It's all about repetition, hearing the same words and phrases in different contexts until they become ingrained.
That's so true. No one hands a toddler a dictionary and expects them to memorize it.
Exactly.
It's all through hearing and repeating naturally.
Exactly. The same principle applies to audio.